The power of the nobles was predominantly based on their land ownership. At the time, 75% of Europe lived in the country, tilling the land of the nobles. These peasants worked in family structures and economies. These individuals were often extremely impoverished. This class was vulnerable, exploited, and dependent. However, the degree of their misfortune was often based on geography. The peasant class of France enjoyed some amount of power, owning a portion of the land in France. However, peasants had to pay their lord or seigneur to use their utilities, such as his mill or oven. These were called banalities. Furthermore, the seigneur could require the peasants to work for him a certain number of the days out of the year. Peasants in England were entitled to the rights of English citizens. However, they were still vulnerable to landowners and nobles. English game laws prevented people without X amount of land from hunting game. This legislation is indicative of Parliament and the landowners attempting to gain dominion over social and economic statuses. During economic hardship, poaching often became an outlet for food. This legislation is exemplary in conveying the burdens placed on the peasant class. Peasants in Eastern Europe, namely Russia, had very few rights and were subjugated by their lords. Unlike Western Europe, serfdom still reigned supreme there. In Prussia and Austria, landlords held complete power over their serfs and were mandated by law to service their lords. This was known as a robot. Peasants in southeastern Europe were completely free. However, this was driven by scarcity of labor. Regardless, peasants were still abused by landlords, which increased as time went on and the Ottoman Empire declined. They were often completely dependent on their landlord for his housing and tools. In 1785, by the reign of Catherine III, the aristocracy's power was completely reinstated from its days under Peter the Great. While these mostly affected nobles, it completely destroyed any social mobility the peasants could possibly have in Russia. The landowners also presided over the courts, giving them domination over the peasant's life from a legislative perspective. Russian lords regarded their serfs as mere economic commodities and could demand as much work from their serfs as they saw fit. Serfs had no legal recourse against their lords. Peasant rebellions arose in Russia, targeting Western customs, increased taxes to their feudal lords, or abnormally brutal landlords. This unjust treatment would be contested in Russia when Pugachev staged a rebellion. The rebellion happens when Catherine II came into power after the previous leader, Tsar Peter III, was assassinated. Pugachev claimed his rebellion was to end the unjust practice of serfdom. It was beginning to look as if Pugachev would succeed in his rebellion after losing a couple of skirmishes. Catherine II sent General Michelausson to quell this rebellion. Pugachev was captured and later executed. This disheartened many peasants since he had acquired a substantial following, showing the only promising recourse against serfdom. Peasant lives ultimately improve in the 18th century, at least in Western Europe. Regardless, this improvement is not substantial, and peasants continue to be subjugated and left vulnerable and exploited by the upper class.